Welcome back to Season 2 of Governance This Week. My name is Roeland Scholtalbers, and with experts at the School of Transnational Governance, we'll look at developments in governance beyond the state. While we were gone this summer, the world kept spinning, obviously. The war in Ukraine is still raging, and a Hamas attack on Israel caused a fierce response. This rekindled the fire of regional spats, and it had global implications. The question is, what does this mean for Europe as a geopolitical actor? Fabrizio, the geo is definitely back in geopolitics.
I suppose so, Roland. There's definitely a return of geopolitics in the way some of these momentous and tragic events are being framed, and they are being talked about and then acted upon in terms of policy making. So this is something that is almost a reflex that is taking place. You could argue at the same time that when it comes to Europe, as you were referring at the beginning, this actually predated the last couple of years when geopolitics has really made a comeback. The current commission branded itself as a geopolitical commission already back in 2019, and to mark this, the whole college went to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to meet their counterparts in the African Union, and since then you have recurrent references to the need for Europe to speak the language of geopolitics. In fact, the High Representative Borrell spoke about power, the language of power that Europe needs to speak. And the question is whether indeed this is the suitable or effective framing for Europe to deal with these events.
So, Fabrizio, let's take a closer look at the definition of geopolitics and some misconceptions.
Yeah, look, at a very minimalistic level, geopolitics concerns the determinants of power and influence over a certain geographical space. And of course, you can have in there considerations that span demography or even environmental sciences. We are in Florence, Italy, so one could say for Italy, the Mediterranean is the salient geopolitical environment, which is both the place where power is projected and vulnerabilities are apparent. But in the way in which it is being talked about and referred to in the public discourse, you can say the understanding of geopolitics is much expanded to that. And you can see this in the language of some of our adversaries like Russia, some of our challengers like China, or even some of our partners like the United States. And there I would say, this really draws back on a very long tradition from the 19th century about, understanding and explaining events in a geopolitical fashion. And it strikes me that, as opposed to the more minimalistic one, this understanding of geopolitics is much more adversarial. I mean, it is really about a zero-sum game where one side wins while another has to lose. It has to do, of course, in due course with the relevance of how territory is defined. Even ethnicities and ethnographic elements are being redesigned. It is much faster. So if you like, geopolitics is a kinetic force, meaning that you act on it in a rather fast way. And of course, we have seen this over the past 2 years in Ukraine. It can be brutal. Geopolitics can be brutal. And the question is worth pondering is whether Europe, the European Union, is equipped to deal with geopolitics in this way.
So how does the EU position itself in this geopolitical world?
So you could argue that there are always a number of attributes that are put together with EU foreign policy: civilian power, normative power, and now, of course, we are in the phase where it should be a geopolitical power. But really, the other terms reflect an understanding of world affairs and order that have to do with the promotion of a rule-based society. It has to do with things like, for example, regulation and being a power that can regulate. And this, of course, is slightly in contrast with the more adversarial way that I described before. You could argue that the EU performed in a geopolitical way in that sense. For example, in relation to Ukraine, I mean, our ability to impose 11 packages of sanctions and to stay united in the face of the Russian aggression, it's certainly an example of that. But of course, most recently, we have seen how, in many respects, the Middle East, as has always been the case, it is really the litmus test for this claim of being a geopolitical power. Only last week we have seen a vote at the UN General Assembly regarding the protection of Palestinian population during the Israeli-Hamas war, and irrespective of the substance of that vote, European countries went each their own way. So you had 8 of them voting in favor, 4 of them voting against, 15 of them abstaining. And this is precisely the problem that prevents, or one of the problems that prevents Europe to act also fast. That is what it would be required to be decisive in this environment.
Fabrizio, what needs to change for the EU to become a more credible geopolitical actor?
So I would say the first thing is really to lower expectations in a way. There is this old adage from Cambridge political scientist Chris Hill about the so-called capability expectation gap, which is about EU foreign policy more broadly. I would say this gap is especially evident when it comes to a geopolitical Europe, and therefore, it is always a good idea to be able to match expectations with what we are actually able to deliver. The second thing I could think is, not to throw the baby with the bathwater. I mean, there are a number of things that the EU and member states more broadly did extremely well. Precisely in the sphere of being a regulatory superpower or being even a normative force in the world. And, these don't necessarily qualify as geopolitical, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So case in point, the EU enlargement process. Now we are in a situation where, in the face of Russian aggression, the tool that the EU has been using, or one of them, to show its defiance and reaction to Russia's imperialism, is to present enlargement as a geopolitical instrument. And it is true that enlargement has been billed as the most successful foreign policy of the EU, but it is also true that what the EU delivers through that is not necessarily geopolitical. Geopolitical is perhaps the end result, the side effect, but the tool in itself is about transforming countries from within because they willingly decide to reform. And well, is that compatible with a view of geopolitics that is, as I mentioned before, kinetic, fast, brutal? Not necessarily. And this is perhaps my last point. Geopolitics in the past couple of years was brought to Europe. Events brought geopolitics into Europe, and we had to somehow adjust to that. But perhaps in our way of framing these events, it doesn't necessarily serve our purpose very well to follow it. It's like chasing a chimera, if you like. We are trying to follow this language and this framing, but doesn't necessarily suit what we do best in the world.
Fabrizio, thanks for being with us today to have a closer look at a geopolitical Europe, myth versus reality. Dear viewers, a lot upcoming in the next few weeks. We're going to discuss issues of disinformation, a digital euro, international bureaucracies, and much more. The climate summit is coming up at the end of November, and we'll also have a look at that. So stay with us and don't forget to subscribe to the SCG channel.